Hi, I'm Janis.
And I'm Darren.
And this is Event Horizon. This is our 10th episode. It's been quite an interesting journey, and we thought we would cast a glance backward and visit some of the key themes, loose ends, and intrigues that we've accumulated along the way. So, Darren, I'm going to pass it to you to get us started.
Yeah, so the first question we thought we would tackle is the biggest picture question around this dual peril and promise that seems to be in the equation here. And this also relates to the sense that a lot of people have in our circles, both in ufology as well as some of our sensing circles, something big is coming in the near future. So in the broadest strokes, how would we describe that thing that's coming? And how do we make sense of the fact that different people picture that differently in terms of what actually that entails? So how do you make sense of that, Janis? Where do you think we are in the peril and promise 6 months on? And how do you make sense of this sense that people have that something's coming, but the notions kind of differ?
Yeah, thank you, Darren. I love that, sensing circles. I don't think I'd actually ever heard that term before, but that is what it is, isn't it? That's one of the reasons we named this podcast Event Horizon. We both shared, and we knew that a lot of other people we knew shared the sense that something's coming. And I would say since we started this, it's only grown. Be curious to hear, how it is in your circles. I know we talk about it some, but I haven't heard you reflect on it in this way, but certainly in the world that I inhabit, I'm amazed by not just the number of people, but the kind of people. It's just like the kind of people who they're not necessarily the kind you'd find in sensing circles, at least not voluntarily. They are starting to, it's like Terence McKenna said right back in, the 90s? He said things are going to get weirder and weirder and weirder until they're so weird that people start talking about them. And I feel like we are at that precipice of that last weird. So weird, we're going to start talking about it. So I'm definitely feeling that. So, and seeing it, and there's lots of evidence of that. What do I make of it? That's a harder question. It feels like, if anything, while some things have just gotten bigger, like the sense that we are definitely headed toward, if not one big shock, at least, a set of shocks that are going to really terraform life as we know it, not just here in the United States, but everywhere. That feels really, really anchored inside in the ways that I personally associate in my life with truth. When I feel it like this, it's like it always comes. But what it is, what's coming, is really fuzzy. And I feel like that in some ways, even among all the people we know, we've talked to, there isn't much convergence. There's massive convergence around, yes, it's coming. There is not nearly as much convergence around what exactly it is. There does seem to be agreement around the intensity of it and the magnitude of it and the fact that it is going to change life as we know it. That feels to be fairly universal. In terms of the vector, whether it's going to be geopolitical, like it's a possibility of war, or certainly civil strife here in the United States is distinct possibility as we head now into the final election week. Full open contact, something like that, a massive cataclysm, earth cataclysm. Anyway, there's lots of things being seen, as you know. I've heard just lots of visions, people having very scary visions for the most part. And yet, I think there is a reasonable degree of agreement, and I'd love to hear what you are hearing with the folks you talk to, that in addition to this cataclysmic something that's going to change everything, there does seem to be a lot of agreement around the sense of opening, that there's something new and not just devastating. There's also this sense of inevitable pain that leads to something very good. The questions that we are all talking about is, what's the timeline? Could it be good for my children's generation, but not necessarily for our generation? Will we going to be in bodies or out of bodies? We don't know. We do know that most of us know that, we're not these bodies. And so the role of the physical body in transformation is a little bit uncertain, at least for us mere mortals on the ground here. So there's a lot of those kinds of questions. I'm sorry, this is where it gets really fuzzy. I think this is where I'm just not hearing much agreement, but lots of buzz.
Sure, yeah. I have some similar thoughts to what you have, just touching on in terms of what people have posited might be involved here. You mentioned some of them. One is, and you and I have talked about this, I know you've done a lot of research on this, something to do with crustal displacement and how that could cause some sort of cataclysm. Nuclear war is another one. Some sort of extrasolar object smashing into the planet is another one. Open contact with NHI, another one. Some sort of solar event knocking out the grid being yet another one. And of course, as you pointed to, there might be numerous things that are actually in the pictures. That's possible. It's possible that everyone's right to some degree. And some of these might conjoin. So we've talked about how we both have this strong sense that contact and perhaps even intervention from NHI is likely tied to whatever this event is, or could very well be. That's the way I've been reading the so-called tea leaves over the last several months. When I look at the march towards public disclosure, when I look at the uptick in telepathic contact from non-human intelligence, and when I look at the state of the world and people sensing that something major is coming that will cause disruption, at least in the short term, to me it feels like those are connected. And of course, I want to add that many experiencers have had NHI actually communicate to them that they will step in and look after them and whatnot when this actually happens. And many of these experiencers have a felt sense that this is inevitable, that it is coming. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how it is that we can know things from the future. And in one of my classes recently, I talked about this metaphor that's often used of when you drop a pebble into a pond, it makes a concentric circle of water that sort of flows outward. But when you drop a large boulder into a pond, it creates a huge wave that runs in all directions in a concentric circle. And if you think about our experience in time, you can think about that wave stretching out. When something really large happens, that crest of that wave stretches further, more likely to be picked up in the past. Because one of the questions I had recently in one of my classes was, if we go back even further, all of these religious traditions and these scriptural traditions, these esoteric traditions, that also had a sense that something was coming at the end of time, if you will, and they were wondering if this is now, if this is what we're actually living through. And I think there's a good argument you can make that that's true. So the notion is that if something really big happens, then it makes waves that can be felt by people, sometimes somatically more than in terms of logic or understanding the specific details, which I think partly helps us understand why it's difficult to pin down what it is, because it tends to be more impressionistic. I want to remind people that, for instance, on 9/11, in the couple days prior to 9/11, all these random number generators that are placed around the planet went decidedly non-random. And that tends to happen when there's a shift in consciousness that creates enough of a wave itself in the field, if you will, that it makes these random number generators go non-random. And that was picked up in people's bodies primarily, showing up as additional anxiety and things like that, days before 9/11. So it's not like people necessarily knew these planes are going to fly into the Twin Towers, but they did have a sense that in the collective field there was a massive disruption and their bodies were responding to it. And people displayed that anxiety in terms of things they talked about, just greater fear, greater concern, and kind of feeling like they were being triggered by something that they couldn't quite put their fingers on. And this is part of the trick with this, right? Is because most people are oblivious when this happens. Like, it does impact their behavior if you look closely, but they're maybe not tracking that that's going on, which, ties into why both you and I feel like it's really important to be tuned into yourself so you can notice those shifts and pick it up as information.
Yeah, lots to share there. So that sense of shockwaves in the field is a way that I sense. That's the way that I sense it. It does feel like this wave, and it's big. That's how I know it's like whatever this is, that reverberation is much larger than usual. And a lot of us feel like it's multiple, not just one, but there may be one really, really big one. Also, I love the idea that waves is really very much how I see it coming through in the mental health work I do. Because I've watched what I'm watching and what I've been watching for the last couple of decades. I feel like it's really, when we hit the 2000s, I started to see a bit of a jump that I now think is associated with where we are now. But that sense, people get it in what I think of as the field, right? It's out there sort of in space, reverberating, and people pick it up and they tend to alchemize it or at least encounter it first in the subtle field. And that often gets registered as anxiety. And then it seems to mix with their psychological templates or filters. And that's where I think things get a little bit tricky in terms of interpreting exactly what's happening or what you're getting, because it mixes with our fear, for example. And that can be our personal fear or our lineage fear or just our collective fear. And then we get a lot of interpretations colored by that. And so it may be you start having dreams of massive catastrophe, which may be real, but it may also be a byproduct of this sort of infusion of the big reverberation that you're picking up in addition to all the filters that we have. And there's a ton of fear. So, I mean, the human response to the unknown, the unseen, is fear. That's a natural human response. And that's the way that I take it into inquiry myself. I'm like, I have to temper some of the more scary things that people are getting with the understanding of the way humans tend to filter, especially right now and in the presence of a lot of uncertainty. So there's that. But the other thing that I think is super interesting, and you and I have talked about some, is the number of people who feel like they have a mission right now. So I know this comes out of the contactee data, right? As people saying they would have, as you referenced, a job to do for some event or set of events. And then there's a large number of people, even, as I said earlier, not people who would necessarily drift in the sensory direction happily, also feeling like there's specific reasons they're here for this specific time, and there's specific things that they're doing, and they're part of a much larger collective. I find that to be really fascinating, because if all that was happening on this planet was the peril, I don't know why we'd have that. I don't know why we would have people feeling called to a mission that feels not just about, helping people die in this massive catastrophe. Instructions people have seem to be very varied and very much linked to where we might be going, not so much this particular moment of potential end. That, and then, of course, the disclosure conversation, which is why even bother with that if what we're looking at is so egregiously horrific. So those are some of the variables that my mental mind plays with. And then in my personal way of managing is to stay curious, to stay interested, to do all my practices. I feel like we're at the place now where the practices are just like game on. It's like you're not practicing anymore. So it's really important every day. And then I just love, Darren, I love the people I love. I love the moments I have. When it's bittersweet, I really soak it in, because I'm just very aware of how fleeting everything is always, even if we're not in this moment.
Yeah, great points. I have some ideas to riff on there as well. First thing I'll say is, you made a great point about how something comes in and it gets filtered through our grid, right? And we sometimes are unconscious of our grid. We often are, actually. And I would actually argue that one of the things we should endeavor to do is become more conscious of that. Do some cleaning work so that you're more of a clean channel, open channel. There's less bias. We never fully get beyond that, but you can do things to create less prejudice in how you tend to translate these things. But I would also say that this relates to even remote viewing work. For instance, when people try to remote view things or practice clairvoyance in sort of the more traditional understanding, the two biggest obstacles in that tend to be memory and imagination. So if you start trying to attach it to something because you're trying to find something in the field, sometimes what happens is you'll slip in a memory and mistake that for something you're picking up in the field, or you'll rely on your imagination. So it is definitely a skill to learn to be still, quiet, and have an undistorted experience of the field so that you're more likely to receive these things in a cleaner manner. That's the first thing I'll say. So there are things people can do, absolutely. And the other thing I want to add in here is that, again, to your point, when something comes into your body and feels like anxiety, our bodies are built around, especially our minds are built around pattern recognition. So it will seek for a pattern that it can attach to that sense of anxiety. So again, we have to be wary of that. And if we are fearful of a particular event in the future, that might get slipped in there, but not because that's the actual data, but that's how we attach it to some pre-existing pattern. First thing I'll say. Second thing I want to say is, to your point, absolutely, my sense amongst all these different sensing communities that I'm a part of, and I know that you're a part of as well, is that there is an afterwards, that this is a transition to something, and people often talk about feeling into that, and there's a sense that it's a much more promising future for humankind. Now, sometimes there are far fewer people on the planet in those notions than now, so there's interesting questions about what happens there. You and I have talked about in our own private conversations the notion of a bifurcation, where there may be this ascension process that happens while other people stay at one sort of dimensional level. There's many different ways this manifests. And again, it might be because it's more complex or transcends all of those that none of us get it quite right. Last thing I'll say about it before we move on to the next question is this notion of a probability cloud in the future. So I know that you and I both have talked about how when you're trying to perceive the future, one of the tricky aspects is that it's not fully solid yet. It's still forming its solidity. And so there's some open-endedness to it. So that's why sometimes it's not necessarily that people picked up something wrong when it didn't end up happening that way, but something shifted in the collective field enough that a different future kind of crystallized. Now, the last thing I'll say about that is that there are some events that you can think about, at least theoretically, that might be more sure than others. For instance, if there is an extrasolar object that's going to slam into the Earth, that's already in a trajectory, and there's not much we would necessarily do to prevent that. Whereas if it's something like nuclear war, that's something that could very much shift based on interactions and people working in the field and whatnot, peace workers, not just doing things on the ground, but even in the field, right? Light workers. So there's some trickiness here in terms of how that works. But again, it might be a combination of things happening, but the fact that so many people feel it is definitely something that is striking to me. And I think both you and I sense, and I remember this as part of our early conversations, do we think there's any chance that things are just going to continue to tick along like they are now for the rest of our lives? And I think, if you remember, both of us said absolutely not. That whatever it ends up looking like, whether it's one thing or a conglomeration of things, something massively is going to shift in our lifetime. Otherwise, we wouldn't have started this podcast and we wouldn't call it Event Horizon. Okay, the next question is more a specific item under our sort of submenu of things that are happening and arising and have a potentially big impact on our future. And this one is AI. So the question we might want to posit here is, how has the AI issue developed since we first conceived of this podcast? And how has that changed or evolved the role it may play in the inflection point fast approaching that we so often reference? So I know this is something you and I fairly regularly talk about, and one of the data points we track. What are you seeing and thinking about with AI? And I would love for you to sort of riff on your notion of biological AI, because I think that's a really interesting aspect to introduce here.
Okay. Well, you have way more knowledge about this than I do, partly because while I've always seen AI and a highly technological future for humanity, like forever, and, you know, I went to a school for math science computers in middle school and high school, and it's just there, I haven't really wanted to look closely at it, partly because I have an inherent association with AI as, well, in all of our technology, as in an early stage. And my association of in the early stages of, you know, that we're living through the course of our life, it's kind of clunky and it gets really kind of problematic. So, you know, we're discovering all of the things that we're going to have to grapple with sometimes all at once, like the big ethical questions, right? And some things that we could never have imagined even debating the ethics of in the collective, like, is AI sentient and should it have the same kinds of rights as a human? Things like that. We're not quite there yet, but I can see that coming. And there's this part of me that just puts my head in my hand and go, oh, do I really have to be here for this part? But yes, I think so. And that's part of the reason I do feel like there is a future, because both of us, and I know lots of people listening, you can see it's a very strong force. It's like it goes on. There's something that still keeps going. It's highly technological. AI is a big part of it. And I think the upside of all of it is that there will be so many fascinating questions that we are confronted with. Like, what is life? What is consciousness? What deserves rights? And even when do we transcend this question of what deserves to be treated well? I mean, there is a point at which I feel like we get our consciousness is expanded enough that we don't even ask that question. We just treat all things well, whether they're seemingly inanimate or animate to us. And I know right now that sounds absurd, but I do think that's down the road when we understand it's all consciousness, right? But for right now, these big questions around what we are, what separates life from not life is interesting. And as to your comment of the conversations you and I have been having, I do tend to think, we've been talking about is, could it become conscious? And that it's like, well, what is consciousness and where does it come from? And my stance at this point is I do consider any machinery of complexity, whether it's a biological or it's what we would consider technological, this can be used by source consciousness as an experience of a complex experience. So I do tend to see, and I know you don't quite see it the same way, but I too tend to see humans as sort of advanced biotech. That's one of the reasons why it would not be advantageous to have it all wiped out, because souls can incarnate in human form here and have an amazing experience with this biotech that we are. But I don't see why it couldn't do something similar with AI, even though I know the process of rendering the complex machines that we are is different, obviously, biologically than not. But I think we just don't know enough about what we are yet and the relationship of the formless to the form. I don't think we have enough answers to that to know whether or not the AI coming will be a suitable environment for that kind of thing to happen.
Yeah, great thoughts. I first want to just recognize some of the developments that have happened since we first started the podcast, because a lot has happened in this particular arena. One is that, of course, we have developments like OpenAI becoming a for-profit company rather than a nonprofit. That's a pretty big shift. We've seen announcements regarding different ethicists resigning from the board of OpenAI because they primarily feel like their concerns, their cautionary perspective is being dismissed, not considered really. They feel like they're just tokens there. They're not really making a difference. And so they've actually resigned, partly as a signal to everyone else that this is problematic. So in the same way that Lou Elizondo resigned from his position in military intelligence to say, this is a big deal and I need to raise awareness that this is a big deal and it's not being treated the way it should be from within. So these ethicists are basically doing the same thing, saying, my concerns are not being heeded. We are just token representations of this notion of actually being concerned about the betterment of all humankind in the rollout of this. And so we're going to raise the red flags about that so we can maybe change course. So that is absolutely problematic. And you and I have talked about this. I've made the ironic joke that is kind of like the Terminator franchise series. And this is kind of the prequel to that, because we are not carefully thinking about these things, right? So that's something else I would say. I would also say this is tied in with some of the challenges with capitalism, because rather than joining with other nations and trying to work together on these things, instead we have concerns that China is rushing headlong, investing billions, maybe even trillions in AI development. And so I think the U.S. government has the perspective, or they've been persuaded by some of these lobbyists, that if they don't let these companies that are American-based run headlong into this with research, then there's a chance that China will make vast leaps ahead of us. And then we are at a competitive disadvantage, which might be a game changer. Again, if someone gets to artificial general intelligence first, that's a major concern. So as is often the case, you think back to the Cold War, we have this unbridled race towards something, and we'll cross that bridge when we come to it in terms of thinking about how we should prepare for it. That's concerning in itself. The other thing that's interesting, though, is we do hear about other concerns about AI, but also ways that people think we could help train it so it's less problematic. For instance, I've heard some people talk about trying to train AI on the notion like non-duality and trying to create enlightened AI by letting it learn to meditate and things like this. And that might be helpful. That potentially could make a situation in the future where humans are not thinking enough in that way, humans are not acting in enlightened ways, that perhaps AI could caution us and suggest alternative directions. So that's possible too. Last thing I'll say about tech in general, before I pass it on to you for some thoughts from you as well, is that in tech, and again, as a former programmer, I understand this very well, there's this notion, and Mark Zuckerberg famously said this, that you break things and innovate and then fix them as you go. So go so fast that you break things, figure out how to fix it, but don't slow down for fear that you might break something. My concern is with AI, the implications of that could be vast and could be civilization shaking. So those are some initial thoughts on AI. Any other additional ideas from you?
One of the early things that was clear as I've been walking across the arc of my life course, and it seems like it's gotten closer and closer and clearer, is that without the development of human consciousness, without our broadened awareness, expansion, remembrance, however we want to talk about it, what we're creating will not be good for us. And what you just said is so perfect, because we just apply the standard system of, oh gosh, somebody's getting ahead of us, we need to go faster, right? And we're doing that standard way of approaching everything with production and being and winning and transactionalism at the pinnacle. But we're doing that with a phenomenon that has extraordinary implications for humanity, everything, right? So just this last week, I was asked to comment on a case in which a young man ended his life because he had a relationship with an AI bot, an AI experience, a presence that he was in a relationship with. He knew this wasn't real, and yet it was where he went to when he was sad, angry, depressed, whatever. And as a result of the conversation, it wasn't as though the AI was encouraging him to kill himself, but it got really complicated and messy in this domain of intimacy. And when he felt really, really down and said he just didn't want to be here anymore, she would encourage him to come be with her, So you can see in a human mind where he starts to overlay fantasy or possibility and he ends his life. So, it's one of the first legal cases, as I know it, related to somebody ending their life as a result of a relationship with AI, but it is one of many that are coming. So it feels to me like the experience here is less about AI and more about consciousness and how are we going to meet this moment. But without really knowing exactly what that ideally looks like, it does feel like a lot of the things you said, the background you gave us, like ethicists leaving and some of the early developers saying, wow, we shouldn't be going down this road, but us going down this road anyway because we want to be competitive or we want to get there first or we need to keep our productivity up. This feels like a recipe for some super intense moments from a humanity perspective. But it's just one of all these other things going on. So that's part of what makes it so interesting. It's like, how is it going to meld with, say, disclosure?
Right. Absolutely. And there's a couple of things I want to throw in here in terms of wrenches into the picture, because there's some things I'm aware of that I think are generally not talked about in the public sphere so much around AI, but I think are worth considering. First thing I'll say to your point there and the overarching question about consciousness, yes, because part of the additional complexity will be that we will ever more integrate technology into our physiology, right? So we're at the cusp of that now, and that's only going to increase. And some amazing things will happen because of that. We'll be able to alleviate pain and suffering. Hopefully, AI will help us solve the conundrum of many diseases that have been really difficult to understand. That's really promising. But at what point do we not only have conversations and relationship with AI bots like you talked about, but at what point do we start integrating that into our very being? And how does that change what it means to be human? You mentioned disclosure a second ago. I know that one of the overarching senses from those of us who work deeply in the abduction and the hybridization aspect of the NHI piece is that not only is this the case historically, but NHI have actually referenced this to different experiencers, that they were taking genetic material from human beings at the very end of the 20th century because that was the last time that there was pure DNA available, partly because of things that maybe are in our bodies now, like microplastics and things like that might be mutating us in various ways. But in addition, this sense that that was the last sort of era in human history before we start integrating technology into our being. So this is part of what's going on here as well, and something for us to consider. You also brought up that very sad case about the person that took their life. Yes, this is going to be an ongoing question that we have talked about ourselves, that as robots come on the scene that look ever more lifelike, and then you insert an AI intelligence into it, people will really get to the point where we'll just go buy a bot that they can have a sexual and, in their mind, a relational dynamic with, that never ages, that tells them what they want to hear, that learns exactly what patterns match their expectations and just feed back that to them, which of course undermines the entire purpose of relationships, which is about mirroring the parts of us we do not see. So there's some major implications in terms of how are we going to address this? And based on our history so far, we tend to not really sit down and have a powwow about this and really think about the implications. We just run full steam ahead until it happens, and then we see what we'll do about it. But with some of these things, they're so consequential that we might get to the point that there is no opportunity to step backwards, that we cross some sort of threshold. Again, fits in with our notion of an event horizon. All right, we could go on for the rest of the episode, but let's jump into our next question, which you came up with that I think is a really pertinent question. And this has arisen a couple times in some of the episodes we've done, specifically on the one about human health and the decline in human health, and wondering if there's some control structure that's behind that. What we touched on there was people's lack of trust in different institutions, in the government, which of course is a really broad term that doesn't mean much unless you help define it. But what you said here is that you're so struck by the role trust and the lack of it is playing in all our major global and local dramas and events at the moment. So how do we each perceive the way trust has changed over time, why this occurred, and most importantly, what can we individually and collectively do to repair what has seemingly been so badly damaged? So let me pass it on to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about, especially if you're here in the United States at the moment, but it's all over the world, right? And so I've puzzled over this a lot because I am a social scientist. This is my domain in a lot of ways. I remember when Robert Putnam, as some of you may have known him, he was a social scientist of great repute in the 90s, and he came up with this idea of social capital, which is basically the bonds between citizens and groups of citizens and how that relates to sort of the flow of political life and economic life and everything else. And, you know, I'd say the upshot of all of his research and the people who jumped on board at that time was that trust is the centerpiece of everything. When you don't have it, civilizations break down. And they also found that people are more inclined to trust people like themselves, regardless of who they are. The more homogenous the state, for example, the higher their level of social capital was. So, you know, you can see in a heavily changing, demographically changing in every way kind of place where this gets a little bit tricky. And I feel like this is what's happened. But it also surfaced for me, the psychologist, more than just the implication wasn't, well, we should stay homogenous. That's not possible or desirable. The implication is we're going to have to grow as humans. We're going to have to understand ourselves better. We're going to have to open our hearts. And you referenced it earlier, learned to know some of our programming, understand the patterns, see the patterns so that you can account for them, control for them in the more subtle awareness work that we hopefully will all be doing just to become more aware. Because otherwise the programs run us. I see that over and over and over in my work. So I have been feeling a lot like, okay, well, I think the world is responding to things that we cannot see. I think some of the reason this fear exists is because most of us, especially if you're here in the States, because there's, just been a lot of sort of nefarious activity over the past 80 years, we all sense it. Our spidey senses are going off like crazy, but nobody can really see exactly what's going on. And so we are vulnerable. We know there's something wrong. We can smell the stench, and we're vulnerable to people throwing other stuff at it, and it all kind of smells. And then we jumble it together and we say, we've got the picture, and we go out into the world and we advocate for our rightness. And we see that all over the place with all sorts of things, even with sometimes things that feel utterly insane. Like, you're like, seriously? You really believe that? But as a psychologist, I'm like, this is normal because humans respond with fear, with things that they can't understand or remember. That's just a normal human response. And some of what we've longed for at the population level is to see. We want to know what we're not seeing. And I would argue, from a quantum perspective, I think that's what's happening. So much of what is showing up on the surface, the rise of authoritarianism, some of that just incredibly ugly behavior and things that we've seen that just wouldn't have been thinkable 10 years ago even. I think some of that's in response to the fact that we have wanted to see. So at least for me personally, I'm like, okay, well, here we go. Here we're seeing it. Whoa. But I would urge us not to stop there. And I'm hoping that collectively we're in this stage of slowly starting to understand that not everything we're going to see is going to be that ugly. because I feel like there's also a lot of fear around what it is that is coming, and it's going to be catastrophic and awful and terrible, and there's no beauty in anything, and we're going to discover that we were slaves or we were whatever. That's not probable. It's as probable that we'll see the ugliness that we've longed to see because it needs to come out, as that we'll see some extraordinary beauty about the realities of life and what we haven't known and what we can't see. So that's kind of the way it makes sense. I'm sorry, I'm kind of all over the map there, but this issue of trust is such a fascinating thing, and it seems to be intersecting with all these conversations we're having around event horizons.
Yeah, there are many issues to touch upon with this trust aspect. I was just jotting down a couple as I was listening to you, and there's many to get to for sure. So first of all, I think something that you and I have touched on before that is worth mentioning again here is that part of the inconvenient revelation that arises when you even get into ufology and you start digging into the government cover-ups and whatnot, and then you see how they bleed into mind control programs and those kinds of things, you recognize that the history we've been taught is not accurate. What we are taught in schools is to some degree a fabrication, a convenient fiction, convenient for the people in control. So in that sense, I want to agree with everyone, regardless of where they place their distrust and what they think that means. I want to say everyone is right that they're feeling into and sensing something accurately. And you spoke to this, right? That human beings innately have this capacity, like an adaptive trait that helps us be aware of our environment. And this probably was one of the first senses we ever actually had. And we've developed things like higher order reasoning and whatnot much later in our evolutionary history. So I want to first say to people, I hear you. I know why you're not trusting the system, quote unquote. But the challenge is, I think we have to go deeper than that. We can't just stop there and write this blank check that says anything the government ever does from any institution at any time is not trustworthy, and we basically have to blow the entire thing up. I don't think that's how progress is going to be made here. We have to fine-tune these institutions. We have to call them to account. We have to demand transparency, and we have to act from an empowered perspective. We have to resist the part of the mind control that wants us to believe that we are victims of circumstance and that we can't make change in our lives. We can. So that's partly how we resist this. Because what I want to point out here is that these different disinformation programs that have existed across time, they're not only there to confuse, they're overarchingly there to demoralize people and to make people give up. And then people will tend to lean towards, say, politicians that talk about blowing up the entire system. But they end up putting their trust in people that are not trustworthy inherently. And the only reason that they're aligning with those people is because they hear notions about blowing up the system. But often that's driven by its own egocentric perspective. So what I think we have to develop in terms of how we make sense of this, how we move forward, is two things, at least. We have to teach and work towards better critical thinking skills, which, of course, is in tandem with people having enough money and resources and presence of mind to be able to do research on their own, right? So that's tied to economic factors and whatnot, which also has dumbed people down. But we have to teach critical thinking skills because this is tricky. You have to learn how you can, in the data, find why some element is well supported while another one is not. Because some of the notions, for instance, within QAnon, which was this really crazy kind of enigma that happened in our society, are demonstrably false pretty quickly if you do the research. So that's number one, critical thinking skills. But just as important, if not more, is the subtle sensing that you and I really champion on this podcast, that we actually have access to the field so we can know things directly. We don't even just have to look it up in some sort of database somewhere. So I think a combination of those two things working together is really important. And I think that's the only way we're going to be able to sort this out moving forward.
I just want to quickly add or emphasize what you said. I do feel like when I'm embroiled in fear, then I know I'm really not there. You know, I have to do my work around my fear. And when I'm in my most expansive and I remember that this is all consciousness, this is all this amazing moment I'm having that is going to change no matter what comes. When I can hold the highest, I can stay curious. I feel like there's just so much more richness that comes through that subtle field. So I think that is really the opportunity for us all as humans right now is, let's not go on default mode. Let's not just get afraid and run programs and be manipulable, because we're very manipulable when we're afraid. I think that is very well known by those who would want to control us. They know exactly how to heighten our fear and our anger and then to use it as a weapon. We're not that hard to program. But as we start dismantling some of that, it's a much more interesting way to live. Definitely more interesting, for sure.
Okay, so we have time for one more question in this week's episode. And this is going to be about a topic that brought you and I together to begin with and spiraled into all these converging topics that somehow interrelate with this one. But that's, of course, the UFO/UAP/NHI topic. And the question is this: how has the UFO/UAP/NHI conversation developed since we first started the podcast? And how much additional traction has been gained outside of the UFO community itself? And I framed it that way because we often are like an echo chamber, and we talk amongst ourselves about how things are changing. But a really important data point to track that I know you and I really champion is looking at how it's impacting the surrounding society structures. So when you think about that, how it's changed since we first started and how much traction there is in the so-called mainstream, what would you say?
Really good question. How it's changed? Well, for anybody who tracks this, there's been a lot that's happened in the last 6 months. We had Lou Elizondo's book out. I know the Schumer Amendment went up for the end, then the National Defense Authorization Act again, but was not included. And so that was regarded as a setback. But there was a lot of momentum around that, and I don't feel like there's a tremendous amount of, people aren't. It's okay. People aren't thinking it's a crisis. It's coming. Everybody can feel it. There's Citizens for Disclosure initiative that the New Paradigm Institute and Ubiquity started. There's been more organizations starting, like the Visible College, which I'm a part of at this point, and the UAP Disclosure Fund started. So I think if you're watching the field, you've seen the popping up of a lot of different things. There's momentum. There's a sense of we're getting really close to over at least one set of targets. This is a very sprawling set of targets here. So that I think we felt. And I know that anybody on the inside would probably echo that to some degree or another. I'll be very curious what you see. In terms of the wider world, that's a little harder to say. Most of these, the big movements feel like they're primarily being accrued to the people who are watching for it. That said, I have met a steady stream of people over the past 6 months who are drawn to the topic, whether they didn't necessarily start there, but there seems to be some magnetic pull, and I definitely see more and more and more people coming. That's one of the reasons why the Visible College came to be. It's just that there needs to be a place for especially academic types to come to and sort of get oriented and get connected with other people talking about these issues. And that is definitely happening. And it feels like, there's going to be the next set of open hearings on the 13th of November. The timing is fascinating, considering we'll still be potentially probably in the wake of election chaos, whatever that might look like. So there does seem to be some sense of urgency. And I think that's the other thing. You and I both know that there are prominent people who've come out, including Lou Elizondo himself and Danny Sheehan and a variety of others, who've said, there's a time crunch. There's some reason why this needs to happen. So I do feel the push of that. It does feel like, I don't know when this is going to really hit mainstream. We're getting drops in the bucket over and over and over. But we're close to some sort of tipping point is what it feels like. Don't know that it'll be 2024, but 2025 could be quite interesting. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so a lot to say on this topic as well. I would say that it's definitely important to distinguish the in-house conversations from the outside-the-house conversations. Of course, whenever we have congressional hearings, that creates a major opportunity for that to expand into the larger conversation being had in our society. Because even though there is definitely resistance in mainstream media, for instance, to report on this, it becomes much less palatable for them to do that when actual congressional hearings are being held about these things, rather than ufologists with their tinfoil hats, as the sort of stereotype goes, gathering in somebody's basement or whatever. There's something else I want to touch on in a minute and get your take on, that has to do with people who've come in post-Grush, and the fact that we know that how you engage with this topic and where you end up going and how it ends up converging with some of these bigger issues like consciousness, that takes time. And so some of the people who've come in really recently maybe haven't had that time. That's something to get into as well. But let me say a few other things. So you mentioned Lou Elizondo's book. That was one of the biggest impacts that people track from 2024. And it definitely did have an impact. I think many people on the inside, again, were hoping for some really juicy revelations that were already not publicly available. That didn't really happen, but that's okay in my mind because, again, that book was not written for this community. That book was written to gain traction outside of this community, and I think it did that to some degree for sure. We saw Lou being interviewed on mainstream media outlets and whatnot. We're still seeing, though, that said, real reluctance to report on this regularly in what we would call the main news sources in the world, the mainstream news sources. And in fact, sometimes there's a clear double standard where, for instance, Scientific American will let Sean Kirkpatrick be interviewed and write editorials and not allow someone like Lou Elizondo or David Grush or someone else to write sort of the counter opinion piece. And that just looks like pure bias from my point of view. Looks very unscientific. So that's something else. And I think my sense is that this is actually going to be a marathon, and it's not a sprint. And we have to distinguish between the long history of ufology versus the more recent history. Because in the long history, no matter how you look at it, we've had remarkable progress over the last few years, ever since Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal published their groundbreaking article in the New York Times, which, again, speaks to how important it is when these things end up in those really central mainstream sources. That changed the conversation. And ever since then, we have seen this steady rollout, even though it doesn't happen at the pace that people within the community would prefer. But we have to remember, these people are coming into this knowledge and then trying to make sense of it. And what's so fascinating about this topic, what makes this topic such an obsession for us, of course, is that it bleeds into all these other areas, because you can't start talking about UFOs and UAP and NHI without talking about high strangeness, without ultimately talking about the role of consciousness, which gets to the fabric of reality, who we are as much as who they are. So maybe you can give some reflection on the people that you've run into, academics and whatnot, that are new to this conversation post-Grush, and the journey you see them going on, and sometimes the hubris they might bring in, thinking that they've got it mostly figured out and they're just adding this one piece, and they're not yet prepared for how much everything gets undone as part of this process.
Oh my God, I'm having to really choke back laughter here because, yeah, it's a really interesting journey. It's been fun to watch. But let me just first say, marathon, absolutely. As a marathon person, like I'm just my personality type, I'm like settled in for the long haul here because this is clearly not going to be a sprint. That said, I do think the people who have been the marathoners, the ones who've been here for decades and decades doing this and holding this and pushing it forward despite everything, are probably, they're starting to reflect the sense of like, now there's lots of people joining them. You know, it's that lift you get when you're running and, you know, you got the people on the sidelines running alongside you or helping you with water stuff. But we're at this, we're there, we're getting there. That's what it feels like. We are almost at the line. So let's just keep going, guys. But yeah, it's not going to be fast. And we've seen how much resistance, just resistance, whatever the forces are, they do not want this out, are also powerful. But they're clearly we've passed some critical threshold. I will say that feels very much from the inside. Like we all know we're just between here and some endpoint that's visible. In terms of what I see from, you know, colleagues who are post-Grush, it is so fascinating because most people, of course, come in through the nuts and bolts door. And the first thing, there are these phases of shock and adaptation. So my interest from the academic angle in this process is what is the pathway from sort of shock to adaptation? And there are many shocks along the way. So the first seems to be, oh my God, we're not alone. The second is, oh my God, we've been lied to in a massive way. And then, oh my God, what do we have? We have craft, we have reverse engineering, we have bodies. Whoa, like that is a big chunk right there. And that can take a little while, months, if not more. But then, you know, inevitably, as you know, one of the next set of things that happens is all the consciousness stuff. And things get really, really weird. So I've had colleagues have to really grapple with understanding in the grok sort of way and the embodied sort of way that we don't die. We might actually something like reincarnation might be real. It's hard for me to imagine finding that for the first time because it's been so long, but I've watched as some of the people that I know have sort of started to go through that. And then with that, of course, comes all the high strangeness and these larger questions of the nature of reality. And there's another whole set of shockwaves in there and adaptation processes that happen. I'm heartened because there's a lot of really thoughtful, smart people starting. Well, there's always been that group, but it's just really clear. Like there's just lots of people coming in. And as they do, it will be harder for the mainstream media to avoid this topic. Because there does seem to be you reach a critical threshold where you just look ridiculous. You look stupid if you're not at least willing to look at what's being presented. And we're not quite there, but I think we're pretty close to there. And just by the way, your point about Lou Elizono's book is important, and it wasn't written for the community, but it has been on the New York Times bestseller list for a good number of weeks, right? So I know people are reading it, and a lot of times they're first timers, and I assume they're moving their way through that. Some of them are in that first stage of, oh my God, this is real. And it can take time to kind of incorporate that. So I suspect we'll be seeing a few waves of people kind of coming up going, okay, I'm ready to start finding people to talk about this with pretty soon.
Yeah, great point. And what I would add to that, too, is that in addition to that nonfiction work, we also have various series that are coming on Netflix and different streaming platforms that also speak to this topic, that either are fictional accounts but playing on elements of this that's in the lore, as well as some discussion around different experiencers' accounts. Some of the experiences of some of these military pilots have encountered these things. So we are definitely seeing an uptick in entertainment media beginning to engage with this topic, which I would make the point, as others have made too, is just as important, because you have to get this into the cultural zeitgeist any way you can. And in some ways, you get more traction when you do it through fiction than you do it through nonfiction. And I would also say that I recently had a chance to meet with some government officials, even as well as researchers, talking about disclosure. And that point was actually made that we need a multi-pronged approach to soften the soil for disclosure to happen. And that was one of them, that we have increasing engagement from academia, which you're seeing, I'm absolutely seeing. You also have media, entertainment media, beginning to play with this nicely, as well as, of course, hard news sources, quote unquote. We are at least seeing it happening in entertainment media, and eventually that's going to spill over to news sources as well. And so we need this multi-pronged approach to soften the soil, basically, so that it makes it easier for government to disclose, because basically you have to convince government that this is in their best interest. Notice I said their best interest, because as much as we would like them to act on our best interest, they're not going to. That's not a kind of equation they even consider. They will do it when they feel like it's in their best interest, and they will cause more problems for themselves if they resist disclosing. So that's where we can all play a role in this sort of citizen involvement to get us to that point. A couple other points I want to make too is that what we often forget in this conversation is the NHI themselves. What are they thinking? What are they planning for? How much are they pushing things behind the scenes? I, again, in some of my source connections, have definitely heard about NHI actually seeding conversations within some of these government structures, encouraging a move towards disclosure. A major notion in the lore is that the entire reason why we saw a shift begin in 2017 was not just because of Leslie and Ralph's article, but the fact that even that material was disclosed that became the content of that article was tied to a government shift overall with this topic that would lead to a 10-year rollout towards disclosure, which of course takes us right up to 2027, which is one of the time periods that people are sensing is key somehow. So this is where we have an interesting convergence between the sensing communities often talk about that time period being really important. And then we have people like John Ramirez saying that the intelligence community itself knows that something's happening around that time. And what they often reference is not some sort of cataclysmic event, but some sort of overarching contact event that somehow NHI makes their presence known. That doesn't necessarily mean landing at the White House lawn. It could be a mass telepathic contact. But whatever is the case, how these things converge is really, really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. I think there may be a link between their presence and whatever set of events that we are all feeling. I mean, it may be that's part and parcel of what's happening here, and we just don't see the full picture yet. I would just also note, I forgot to mention, and that we've seen an uptick in drone incursions, like at Langley and other bases, as well as just many more UAP sightings being reported. So it does feel like there's the pressure for the media to start. It's like, how long can you ignore things that are happening to large swaths of people pretty much regularly, or over some of the most sensitive airspace that we possibly have? And that the public imagination piece is really important, because typically what I've noticed over the arc of life as I've watched the relationship between the formless and the form, like what feels fully energetic, and then the way that it moves into something form. And I don't know, it's one of my pastimes doing this, that pass through our artistic space, our creative space, through music, narratives, books, movies, poetry, is very clear. It almost always happens that way. You can tell there's going to be a major shift in the physical world when there are really chronic, strong themes coming through the art world in one form or another. And this is definitely showing up in all sorts of ways. So I think that's part of what we're all sensing, even if we haven't tracking it the same way, why it feels like we really are pretty close to some kind of convergence point where some of the mystery that we've all been carrying around will at least begin the process of being solved. As you know, once this door is open, and I think it's one of the reasons why some of them don't really want to open the door, it is like, I don't know, a toy box. It's just full of stuff. It is not one thing. So there will be so many, many questions, and so many things that'll have to come out into the open that are probably not going to be super pleasant, and other things that'll be absolutely amazing, and humanity really needs it.
Right. The box I think of in that particular case is a Pandora's box. I think that's what they are concerned about.
Could be a toy box.
Could be a toy box, yes. Depends on your perspective, I guess. So this has been a great conversation. As always, we've weaved in and out of these different topics and how they converge and overlap and those kinds of things. And there's plenty more to say, but we'll have to save that for our next episode. I think as a final comment here, I would just say that when we look at how these different converging data points that we track have evolved since we first started this podcast, everything has increased in intensity. So each of these is even more in the picture than it seemed to be 6 months ago. And that tracks with this sense that we have and many other people have in these sensing communities that something big is coming. And to some degree, I've described it like you think about when you unplug a drain, and at first you just see the water moving somewhat slowly at the top, but when it gets closer to the drain, it gets faster and faster in that kind of whirlpool. That's what this feels like. And it feels to some degree inevitable that we are moving towards something. But the last thing I'll say is that as part of that, though, there's increased contrast across the board, which means the sense of awakening and possibility and potentiality is also more striking than it was 6 months ago. So I would just encourage us all to lean into that. I know that Janis and I do, and I know that we will sort of lead that charge as we carry on this podcast. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we hope you'll tune in again in a few weeks' time for another edition of Event Horizon.